and 1847. Four of the wealthiest plantation families along the Georgia coast met with catastrophic ruin under circumstances so methodically arranged that investigating magistrates could find no criminal to prosecute. Across these estates, 31 people perished from fever, drowning, fire, madness, and what physicians described in sealed testimony as a deliberate self-destruction of the will to live. For 6 years, the pattern connecting these disasters remained invisible to authorities. Concealed beneath the mundane transactions of property sales, estate inventories, and household records, documents no one thought to examine as evidence of warfare. At the center of every catastrophe moved one woman, her name changing with each new owner, her intelligence surpassing that of the men who claimed to possess her, and her methods so subtle that even after the truth came to light, Georgia's legal system found itself powerless to prosecute her for brilliance disguised as obedience. Before we uncover the story of the woman called Dinah, whose 15-year campaign of calculated vengeance would expose the fundamental vulnerability at the heart of Southern slave society, I want to invite you into our community of people who seek the uncomfortable truths that history tried to bury. Subscribe to the Sealed Room and turn on notifications so you never miss these hidden chapters of America's past that they never wanted you to hear. And please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with truth seekers around the world. Now, let's discover what really happened in those plantation houses along the Georgia coast, and why one woman's intelligence became more dangerous than any rebellion. What began as a routine estate liquidation in Savannah during the spring of 1841 set in motion a sequence of events that would eventually require intervention from the governor's office and create legal questions that Georgia's courts are still reluctant to discuss. McIntosh County in coastal Georgia had prospered throughout the 1830s on Sea Island cotton, with the Altamaha River providing access to Savannah's export markets. Rice cultivation along the river's tributaries added to the region's wealth, creating a concentration of extraordinarily rich planters who competed for social dominance through displays of refinement and European sophistication. 4 families controlled the economic and political landscape of the county's southern districts. The Payton family owned Marshfield, a 3,000-acre plantation worked by 143 enslaved people. Nathaniel Payton had inherited the estate from his father in 1832, along with considerable wealth and connections to Savannah's banking establishment. His wife, Elenina, came from Charleston with expensive tastes and a determination to establish Marshfield as the most cultured household between Savannah and Brunswick. Their family included twin daughters, aged 17, both being groomed for advantageous marriages, and a son studying law at the University of Virginia. 10 miles south, the Callaway family maintained Fair Hope, an equally impressive operation specializing in long, staple cotton. Marcus Callaway was 46 years old, served on the county commission, and maintained business relationships extending to textile mills in Massachusetts. His wife Julia was 15 years younger, known for charitable work among Savannah's poor whites, and for hosting elaborate social gatherings. They had 5 children ranging from 8 to 19 years old. The third family, the Hargraves at Riverside, operated with less social pretension, but greater agricultural innovation. Thomas Hargrave, 51 years old and twice widowed, ran his 2,000-acre estate with scientific attention to crop rotation, soil management, and experimental rice cultivation. His 3 adult children had married into neighboring planter families, extending his influence through kinship networks that dominated local politics. The fourth family presented a different profile entirely. The Southernthorlands at Oakmont were relative newcomers, having arrived from Virginia in 1838 with significant capital and immediate social ambitions. Robert Sutherland was 39, his wife Catherine 32, and they had 2 young children. What distinguished the Sutherlands was Robert's intellectual pretension. He fashioned himself a philosopher, planter, hosting discussions of political economy, collecting books, and writing essays defending slavery through elaborate moral and scientific arguments that he published in Charleston journals. In March of 1841, Nathaniel Peyton traveled to Savannah to attend the liquidation of the Middleton estate. Charles Middleton had died suddenly in February, leaving debts that required immediate sale of his property, including 68 enslaved people. Among those being auctioned was a woman listed only as Dinah, approximately 28 years old, described in the estate inventory with unusual specificity. Exceptional literacy in English and Latin, accomplished in household management, medical knowledge, and complex accounting, trained in Charleston schools before circumstances altered her status. Special conditions of sale. That final notation should have warned Peyton. The auction agent explained that Middleton's executors required the purchaser to sign documents swearing the woman would be transported at least 150 miles from Savannah and never allowed to return to the city or its immediate environs. When Peyton inquired about these extraordinary restrictions, the agent's response was carefully evasive. "Estate complications, sir. Legal matters best left in the past. The woman herself has committed no crimes, but the executors feel her presence in Savannah would be inappropriate given the circumstances of Mr. Middleton's death. The price reflected the complications, $700, when a woman of Dinah's described capabilities should command $100,500 or more. Peyton's interest was both practical and status-driven. Eleanor had been demanding a truly educated servant capable of training their daughters in accomplishments beyond what local tutors could provide. A woman literate in Latin, skilled in household management, and possessing medical knowledge would be invaluable. The low price and distance requirements suggested problems, but Peyton convinced himself these were merely estate peculiarities. Perhaps family embarrassments, having nothing to do with the woman's actual capabilities. He purchased Dinah and arranged transport to McIntosh County. When she arrived at Marshfield 3 weeks later, Peyton's first impression was of a woman whose bearing suggested she'd been born to entirely different circumstances. Dinah was tall, with skin the color of polished walnut, and she carried herself with a composure that made servants and masters alike instinctively defer to her presence. She spoke with cultured precision, demonstrating immediate competence in every task assigned. Elenina expressed satisfaction, and within days, Dinah had been integrated into the household's most private spaces, given responsibility for training the twin daughters and managing household accounts. For 2 months, everything exceeded expectations. Dinah proved exactly as advertised. She taught the Peyton twins Latin declensions and French pronunciation, reorganized the household's medical supplies with professional expertise, and reviewed the plantation's account books, identifying several areas where expenses could be reduced without affecting operations. She was quiet, deferential, and remarkably perceptive about the family's needs before they voiced them. But by June, subtle changes began appearing that no one could quite identify. Conversations in the household became tense for reasons no one could articulate. The enslaved community seemed increasingly nervous, watching Dinah with an emotion that looked like fear mixed with anticipation. The overseer reported unusual questioning from field hands about matters that shouldn't concern them. Questions about cotton markets, about which neighboring planters had daughters of marriageable age, about debts and business relationships among the white families. What the Paytons didn't know was that Dinah had spent those first 2 months doing what she always did in a new household, studying. She observed that Nathaniel kept a locked drawer in his study containing correspondence he didn't want Elenina to see. Letters suggesting business arrangements that contradicted his public representations. She recognized that Elenina's refined manner concealed deep insecurity about their social position relative to Charleston families. She saw that the twin daughters, Caroline and Margaret, possessed romantic attachments to young men their parents would never approve of. Attachments they believed were secret. Most importantly, Dinah began building her information network among the enslaved community. She was patient in this work, never pushing, simply listening, and occasionally asking questions that seemed innocent but were precisely calculated. She learned which plantations were struggling financially, which overseers were brutal enough to inspire murderous hatred, which white families harbored secrets that could destroy them, which planters' sons gambled heavily or kept mulatto mistresses in Savannah. Each piece of intelligence was cataloged in her extraordinary memory, organized into patterns of vulnerability that she would exploit when the time came. By late June, Dinah had become indispensable at Marshfield. The Paytons couldn't imagine managing without her. On July 2, 1841, an event occurred that would initiate the actual destruction, though the family wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. Thomas Hargrave visited Marshfield to discuss a business matter with Nathaniel. The two men met in Payton's study while Dinah served refreshments. As she moved about the room, appearing focused solely on her duties, she listened to every word. Hargrave was proposing a joint investment in a rice mill that would process crops from both their plantations, plus several neighbors. The capital requirement was substantial, of $12,000, with each partner contributing half. Nathaniel expressed interest, but privately worried about raising $6,000 in liquid capital without revealing to Eleanor the extent of their recent losses in cotton speculation. After Hargrave departed, Nathaniel sat alone, reviewing figures that wouldn't cooperate with his needs. Dinah entered to clear the service, and as she worked, she spoke quietly. "Sir, forgive my presumption, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with Mr. Hargrave. I served previously in a Savannah household that had business connections to Mr. Hargrave's brother-in-law in Brunswick. There are matters concerning Mr. Hargrave's financial reliability that you might find valuable to know before committing such substantial capital." Nathaniel looked up sharply, surprise and interest warring in his expression. He should have questioned how an enslaved woman possessed detailed intelligence about a respected planter's business affairs. He didn't. The desperation to solve his problem overwhelmed caution. What matters would those be? Over the next 20 minutes, Dinah provided specific, verifiable information about Thomas Hargrave's failed investments, concealed debts to Savannah factors, and partnerships with men of questionable reputation. She presented these facts without emotion or embellishment, like a lawyer presenting evidence. Every detail she offered proved accurate when Nathaniel quietly investigated over the following weeks. What he never learned was where Dinah obtained this intelligence. How she'd spent months cultivating information sources among enslaved people who moved between plantations carrying gossip that white families never imagined reached beyond their private conversations. By late July, Nathaniel had used Dinah's information to force Hargrave into a revised partnership agreement with terms dramatically favorable to Payton interests. He extracted concessions that would never have been possible through normal negotiation. Hargrave signed the new terms with barely concealed rage, knowing he'd been outmaneuvered but unable to understand how Peyton had acquired such detailed knowledge of his vulnerabilities. Nathaniel's success made him increasingly dependent on Dinah's intelligence. He began consulting her regularly, seeking information about other planters, market conditions, political developments. Elenina noticed her husband spending unusual amounts of time speaking privately with their servant, but she attributed this to Dinah's competence, rather than recognizing the dangerous dependency forming. What none of the Peytons understood was that Dinah's intelligence came with an invisible cost. Every piece of information she provided created obligation and dependency. She was making herself indispensable while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the Peyton family's own vulnerabilities. Weaknesses she would exploit when the time came to destroy them. The other enslaved people at Marshfield watched Dinah's elevated position with complex emotions. An older woman named Ruth, who'd been at Marshfield for 30 years, tried warning others. "That woman ain't natural. I seen her type before down in Charleston. Had a cousin told me about a woman like her. Smart as the devil and twice as dangerous. Said she moved through 3 families, and every one of them broke apart like dry wood. Y'all watch. Something bad coming." But Ruth's warnings were dismissed. Dinah had done nothing wrong. She'd simply proven her value through intelligence and hard work. The fact that she was more educated than most white women, that she possessed knowledge beyond what any slave should have access to. These things seemed like fortune rather than warning signs. By August of 1841, Dinah had positioned herself exactly where she needed to be trusted completely. Given access to the family's most private information, consulted on matters far beyond normal servant duties, and secretly assembling a detailed map of vulnerabilities across 4 of the most powerful families in coastal Georgia. The storm that struck McIntosh County on August 19, 1841, tore the roof off Marshfield's carriage house and flooded the rice fields along the river. The damage was significant but repairable. What couldn't be repaired was the sequence of events Dinah set in motion during the chaos of that storm. A sequence that would take 6 years to fully unfold and would leave all 4 families in ruins. The weeks following the storm revealed Dinah's true mastery of psychological warfare, disguised as helpful service. While Nathaniel Peyton struggled to finance repairs without exposing his weakened financial position, Dinah approached him with a solution that seemed providential. She suggested he could secure favorable terms from Marcus Calloway, whose cotton factoring business had excess capital seeking investment opportunities. What Nathaniel didn't know was that Dinah had already spent weeks studying the Calloway family through her network of intelligence sources. She knew Marcus Calloway was desperate to break into the exclusive social circles that the Peytons moved through with ease. She understood that Julia Calloway resented Elenina, Peyton's superior social position, and would welcome any opportunity to elevate Fairhope's standing. Most importantly, she'd learned that the Calloway's eldest son had been courting Caroline Peyton secretly. A relationship both families would oppose if discovered, but which could be exploited to create leverage. Nathaniel approached Calloway in September with Dinah's carefully scripted proposal. The terms appeared mutually beneficial. A partnership that would provide Peyton with necessary capital while giving Calloway access to Savannah banking connections and social networks. Marcus agreed enthusiastically, seeing this as his family's entry into the highest tier of coastal Georgia society. The contract was signed on September 23, 1841, with both men convinced they'd achieved advantageous arrangements. What neither man understood was that Dinah had structured the partnership to ensure future conflict. The terms contained ambiguities she'd subtly suggested to Nathaniel. provisions that would later be interpreted differently by each party, creating grounds for accusations of dishonesty. She'd built a time bomb into the agreement, set to detonate when circumstances made both families most vulnerable. While this partnership formed, Dinah had begun working on Ella Peyton through entirely different methods. She'd recognized that Ella obsession with social status masked deep insecurity about her daughter's marriage prospects. The twin girls were beautiful, but not exceptionally so, accomplished, but not remarkably talented. Ella feared they might not attract the caliber of husbands necessary to maintain the family's social position. Dinah cultivated these fears with surgical precision. During their daily interactions, she would mention casually which planter families had daughters who'd made brilliant matches. She'd note, as if merely observing facts, that Caroline and Margaret were now 17, approaching the age where unmarried girls began losing desirability. She'd express concern, always deferentially, about competition from younger, fresher girls entering society. One afternoon in October, as she helped Ella review invitations to an upcoming ball, Dinah spoke with calculated casualness. "Madam, I noticed Miss Julia Calloway has invited the Beaumont family from Charleston. Their daughter Annabelle is only 15, but I've heard she's considered quite extraordinary. The Charleston families are already discussing matches for her with some of the wealthiest sons in the state." Ella expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Dinah had planted the seed. Over following weeks she watered it carefully, mentioning Annabelle Beaumont repeatedly, always in contexts suggesting the girl was somehow superior to the Peyton twins. She never stated this directly, simply arranged information to lead Ella toward that conclusion herself. By November, Ella had developed an obsessive anxiety about her daughter's marriage prospects, an anxiety that made her vulnerable to rash decisions. The crisis Dinah had been engineering arrived during the Christmas season of 1841. The Calloways hosted an elaborate celebration at Fair Hope, attended by every prominent family in the region. Dinah had not accompanied the Peytons, instead remaining at Marshfield to manage the household. What she'd actually done was arrange for a letter to be delivered to Ella during the gathering. A letter that appeared to be from Caroline to a young man named Michael Ashford, son of a moderate planter family the Peytons considered beneath their social level. The letter, which Dinah had forged with meticulous attention to Caroline's handwriting and manner of expression, contained passionate declarations of love and references to secret meetings. It suggested the relationship had progressed to physical intimacy. Eleanor received this letter from a house servant who claimed to have found it while cleaning, though the servant actually been given the letter by one of Dinah's network contacts with instructions to deliver it during the Christmas gathering, when Ella would be surrounded by her social peers and unable to react calmly. Ella response was exactly what Dinah had calculated. She became hysterical in a semi-public setting, causing a scene that damaged the family's reputation. She demanded the family return to Marshfield immediately, creating awkwardness at the Calloway celebration. And most critically, she refused to listen to Caroline's tearful insistence that the letter was fabricated, that she'd never written such things, that Michael Ashford was barely an acquaintance. The scandal consumed the Peyton household through January of 1842. Ella, convinced her daughter had ruined herself, made desperate attempts to arrange a hasty marriage to salvage the situation. Caroline, devastated by her mother's refusal to believe her innocence, became withdrawn and emotionally unstable. Nathaniel, caught between his wife's hysteria and his daughter's protests, found himself unable to manage his own household, while simultaneously dealing with growing tensions in his partnership with Marcus Calloway. Those tensions had been carefully nurtured by Dinah through strategic whispers to both sides. She'd arranged for Nathaniel to overhear conversations suggesting Marcus was speaking disparagingly about the Payton family scandal. She'd ensured that Marcus learned Nathaniel was privately questioning his partner's business judgment. Neither piece of information was entirely false. Both men had made such comments, but Dinah amplified and distorted them to create maximum animosity. By March of 1842, the Payton-Calloway partnership had collapsed into open warfare. Each accused the other of violating their agreement's terms. The ambiguities Dinah had engineered into the contract gave both men legitimate grievances. Their dispute became a public spectacle, dragged through county courts and damaging both families' reputations. The legal costs were devastating, consuming capital both families needed for spring planting. While the Paytons and Calloways destroyed each other, Dinah had begun her next phase. She'd cultivated the attention of Robert Sutherland, the philosophically inclined planter from Oakmont. Sutherland had noticed Dinah during a social visit to Marshfield in February. He'd been struck by her obvious intelligence, her educated manner of speaking, and he'd engaged her in conversation about classical literature, fascinated to discover an enslaved woman who could discuss Plutarch and Cicero with genuine understanding. For a man like Sutherland, who prided himself on intellectual sophistication, and who wrote essays defending slavery through claims about civilizing inferior races, encountering Dinah created cognitive dissonance that he resolved by telling himself she represented the success of his theories. Here was proof, he thought, that proper instruction could elevate even African slaves to remarkable levels of accomplishment. What he never considered was that Dinah's education predated her enslavement, that she'd been born free and literate, reduced to property through legal mechanisms that his philosophical writings conveniently ignored. In April of 1842, as the Payton household approached complete dysfunction, Sutherland made an offer to purchase Dinah. He presented this to Nathaniel as doing him a favor, removing a servant whose presence had somehow become associated with the family's troubles. Though Sutherland's actual motivation was acquiring a woman whose intelligence fascinated him and whose presence would enhance his intellectual salon gatherings. Nathaniel, desperate for capital to fund the legal battle with Calloway and eager to appease Elenina, who developed irrational hatred of Dinah, agreed to the sale. The price was $2,000, representing substantial profit and solving immediate cash needs. The transaction was completed on April 19, 1842. As Dinah departed Marshfield for the final time, she looked back at the plantation that had been prosperous and peaceful when she arrived 13 months earlier. Now it was consumed by legal warfare, family scandal, and financial crisis. The Payton twins had been damaged psychologically. Elenina was on the edge of nervous collapse, and Nathaniel faced potential bankruptcy. Ruth, the old woman who'd warned others about Dinah, stood near the kitchen house and made the sign against evil as the carriage carried Dinah away. "Lord, have mercy on that Sutherland family," Ruth whispered to the other servants. "That woman destroyed these people like it was nothing. Now she's moving on to the next ones, and they don't even know what's coming for them." Ruth was correct. Dinah had already begun her preliminary study of the Sutherland family during social visits, and she'd identified vulnerabilities that would make their destruction particularly satisfying. Because unlike the Paytons, whose sins were merely greed and social pretension, Robert Sutherland represented something Dinah hated with focused intensity. He was an intellectual who'd built elaborate philosophical justifications for the system that enslaved her. He'd written essays arguing that slavery benefited both master and slave, that it was divinely ordained, that it represented progress of civilization. He'd crafted beautiful sentences defending the institution that had stolen her freedom. Dinah intended to destroy him, not just materially, but intellectually, to dismantle his philosophical certainties and force him to confront the human intelligence and moral agency he'd spent years denying. The Sutherland family's destruction would be her masterwork, more subtle and comprehensive than anything she'd done to the Paytons. She arrived at Oakmont on April 22, 1842, and was welcomed by Robert and Catherine Sutherland with obvious satisfaction. They'd acquired exactly what they wanted: an educated servant who would elevate their household's intellectual reputation. What they'd actually acquired was an enemy of extraordinary capability who'd already begun planning their complete ruin. The first weeks at Oakmont proceeded smoothly, exactly as they had at Marshfield. Dinah demonstrated her exceptional competence, managing the household with efficiency that impressed Catherine while engaging Robert in conversations that flattered his intellectual vanity. She listened to his philosophical pronouncements with apparent admiration, asking questions that encouraged him to expand his theories, all while internally cataloging the contradictions and weaknesses in his reasoning. By June, Dinah had identified the Sutherland family's primary vulnerabilities. Robert's intellectual pride made him susceptible to manipulation through flattery of his ideas. Catherine's insecurity about being a newcomer to Georgia society made her desperate for acceptance from established families. Most critically, Robert's philosophical writings had created enemies among more traditional planters who considered his public theorizing about slavery to be dangerous, attracting unwanted attention from Northern abolitionists. Dinah's strategy for the Sutherlands would exploit all three vulnerabilities simultaneously. She began by encouraging Robert to expand his writings, subtly suggesting themes and arguments that would make his essays more controversial. She helped him research historical examples, provided Latin quotations that strengthened his positions, and generally made herself indispensable to his intellectual work. Robert was delighted to have found such a capable research assistant, never recognizing that Dinah was steering his arguments toward positions that would alienate him from other planters. By August, Robert had published an essay in a Charleston journal that argued slavery should be defended on purely economic and sociological grounds, dismissing religious justifications as unnecessary and possibly counterproductive. The essay created immediate scandal. Ministers condemned it as atheistic. Traditional planters saw it as dangerous intellectual radicalism. Even defenders of slavery were disturbed by arguments that seemed to reduce the institution to mere economic calculation, rather than divinely ordained hierarchy. The controversy suited Dinah's purposes perfectly. While Robert dealt with public criticism, she'd begun working on Catherine through different methods. She'd learned that Catherine desperately wanted acceptance from the Calloway family, seeing Julia Calloway as the gatekeeper to Georgia society. Dinah arranged to provide Catherine with information about Julia's private opinions, information carefully selected and slightly distorted to create animosity. She told Catherine that Julia had spoken dismissively about Oakmont's furnishings during a recent visit. She mentioned that Julia had suggested Catherine's accent betrayed inferior Virginia origins. None of this was entirely fabricated. Julia had made such comments, but Dinah amplified and strategically timed the revelations to create maximum offense. By October of 1842, Catherine had developed active hostility toward Julia Calloway, while Julia, learning through other sources that Catherine had criticized her household management, reciprocated the animosity. The two families stopped speaking, eliminating the social alliance Catherine had desperately sought. While she orchestrated these surface conflicts, Dinah had begun the deeper work that would ultimately destroy the Sutherlands. She discovered that Robert maintained correspondence with several northern intellectuals, men who opposed slavery, but were fascinated by Robert's sophisticated defenses of the institution. Robert enjoyed these debates, seeing them as opportunities to demonstrate his argumentative superiority. Dinah subtly encouraged this correspondence, helping Robert craft responses, suggesting readings, and generally making herself essential to the intellectual exchange. What she was actually doing was ensuring the correspondence became more extensive and more controversial, creating a written record that could later be used to paint Robert as having dangerous sympathies with abolitionists. In the paranoid atmosphere of coastal Georgia in the early 1840s, such accusations could destroy a man's reputation and business relationships regardless of their accuracy. By January of 1843, Robert Sutherland's position in McIntosh County society had deteriorated significantly. His controversial essays, combined with rumors about his correspondence with northern intellectuals, had made him a figure of suspicion rather than respect. Neighboring planters avoided him at public gatherings. Business partnerships he'd cultivated began dissolving. The philosophical salon he'd hoped to establish at Oakmont attracted only awkward silence when he proposed gatherings. Catherine blamed her husband's intellectual obsessions for their social isolation, creating domestic tension that further destabilized the household. Their two children, young Edward and Anne, sensed the unhappiness pervading Oakmont, even if they couldn't articulate its sources. The enslaved community watched Robert's increasing frustration with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that the master who'd written such eloquent justifications for their bondage was being systematically dismantled by one of his own property. Dinah observed all of this with clinical satisfaction. But she wasn't finished. The actual crisis she'd engineered for the Sutherlands would come through their relationship with Thomas Hargrave, whose own vulnerabilities Dinah had been studying with equal attention. Hargrave had never recovered from Nathaniel Payton's exploitation of his financial weaknesses. The rice mill partnership had failed spectacularly, costing him $20,000 and exposing him to creditors who'd previously considered him unassailable. By early 1843, Hargrave was desperate for capital infusion and willing to consider partnerships he would normally reject. Dinah arranged for Robert Sutherland to learn about Hargrave's situation through carefully placed information among the enslaved networks. She ensured Robert understood Hargrave needed a partner with liquid capital and was willing to offer extremely favorable terms to secure one. For Robert, who'd been shut out of other business opportunities due to his damaged reputation, this appeared to be providential. In March of 1843, Robert approached Hargrave with a partnership proposal. Hargrave, suspicious of Robert's reputation but desperate for capital, agreed to preliminary negotiations. Dinah, who'd maneuvered both men into this arrangement, now set about ensuring it would destroy them both. She accomplished this through a technique she'd refined over years. She provided each man with accurate, but strategically selected information about the other. Information that was true but incomplete, creating impressions that were fundamentally misleading. She told Robert that Hargrave's debts were manageable and his land holdings secure, neglecting to mention the extent of liens against those holdings. She ensured Hargrave learned that Robert had capital available from Virginia family connections, failing to mention that accessing those funds required admitting his Georgia failures to relatives who'd already expressed disapproval of his intellectual pretensions. The partnership was formalized in April of 1843 with terms that appeared beneficial to both parties, but actually committed each to obligations they couldn't meet. Dinah had studied the contract language carefully, inserting suggestions through Robert that created ambiguities and contradictions, ensuring future disputes. Both men signed with relief, each convinced he'd achieved favorable terms, neither recognizing they'd just entered an arrangement designed to bankrupt them both. While this commercial catastrophe unfolded slowly, Dinah had expanded her operations to include Marcus Calloway more directly. The Calloway family had never recovered from their conflict with the Paytons. The legal costs and damaged reputation had weakened Hope's financial position. Marcus needed to rebuild his business relationships, but found doors closed throughout the county. In June of 1843, Dinah arranged for information about a lucrative cotton factoring opportunity to reach Marcus through his overseer, who'd heard about it from an enslaved worker at Oakmont, who'd been told about it by Dinah herself. The opportunity was real, a genuine chance to establish connection with a New Orleans merchant house seeking Georgia suppliers. What Marcus didn't know was that Dinah had also ensured this same information reached 2 other planters who would compete for the contract, and she'd provided each competitor with intelligence about Marcus's weaknesses that would be used against him in negotiations. The resulting competition played out exactly as Dinah had orchestrated. Marcus committed substantial resources to securing the contract, ultimately succeeding, but at a cost that left Hope financially overextended. The victory felt hollow, achieved through desperate measures that damaged his reputation further and created new vulnerabilities his competitors would later exploit. By August of 1843, Dinah had positioned all 4 families in states of crisis. The Paytons remained locked in legal warfare with the Calloways, both families hemorrhaging money and status. The Sutherlands were yoked to Hargrave through a partnership that was already showing strain, and Marcus Calloway had overextended himself, securing a contract that would ultimately prove less profitable than projected. What none of these families understood was that Dinah had created an interconnected web of dependencies and conflicts, ensuring that each family's problems would amplify the others. When one suffered setback, it would create cascading effects damaging all the rest. She'd engineered a system of mutual destruction that would continue operating regardless of her presence. This proved significant because, in September of 1843, Robert Sutherland made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of events. He'd become increasingly troubled by contradictions between his philosophical defenses of slavery and the reality of possessing a woman whose intelligence clearly equaled or exceeded his own. His correspondence with Northern intellectuals had forced him to confront arguments he couldn't adequately refute. And most disturbingly, he'd begun to recognize that Dinah was somehow connected to the various disasters afflicting his household and business affairs, though he couldn't identify specific actions or prove criminal intent. On September 14th, Robert called Dinah to his study for a conversation that both of them knew would be extraordinary. He dismissed the other servants and closed the door, then gestured for Dinah to sit, something he'd never done before. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. Robert began by acknowledging what he'd been avoiding, his recognition of her obvious intelligence and his growing suspicion that she'd somehow orchestrated his various troubles. Dinah didn't deny the accusation. Instead, she responded with devastating honesty. "I have done exactly what you suspect, Master Sutherland. I have studied your weaknesses and exploited them systematically. I have manipulated your business decisions, encouraged your controversial writings, and arranged for information to reach your enemies. I have worked methodically to destroy your reputation, your finances, and your philosophical certainties. And I have done all of this while serving you with perfect obedience, breaking no laws, committing no acts that your legal system recognizes as crimes. Robert, shaken by her frank admission, asked the question she'd been waiting for. Why? What did I do to deserve such treatment? Dinah's response revealed the full scope of her history and motivations. Information Robert had never sought, because he'd never considered an enslaved woman's past relevant. She told him she'd been born free in Richmond, daughter of a freed blacksmith and a French immigrant. She'd been educated by tutors her father hired, learning Latin, Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy, and literature. She'd lived as a free person for 22 years, expecting a life of intellectual accomplishment and social respectability within Richmond's free black community. Then her father died in a warehouse fire in 1836. Creditors claimed his estate, and through mechanisms entirely legal under Virginia law, they challenged her free status, producing documents suggesting her mother had actually been enslaved, and that Dinah's free papers were fraudulent. The case was heard by a judge who had financial interests aligned with the creditors. Within 3 months, Dinah had been transformed from free and educated to enslaved property, sold to a Richmond merchant family to satisfy debts. I was 22 years old, Dinah told Robert, her voice calm but filled with controlled rage. I had read Cicero and Aristotle in their original languages. I had studied natural philosophy and mathematics. I understood law, history, and political economy. And then one day, because white men decided they could profit from stealing my freedom, I became a piece of property. Do you understand what that does to a human being? To know you are capable of everything your supposed masters are capable of. To recognize you are likely more intelligent than most of them. But to have society declare you are an object to be bought and sold. She described the years following her enslavement, the shock and rage that had to be concealed, the gradual recognition that physical escape was unlikely, but other forms of resistance were possible. She'd been sold from Richmond to Charleston in 1838, then to Savannah in 1840, each sale teaching her more about planter families and their vulnerabilities. I realized that if I could not be free, I would at least prove something important, she told Robert. I would demonstrate that the people you consider property are capable of destroying you completely. I would show that your assumed superiority is illusion, that your power comes not from inherent worth, but from legal structures that cannot protect you from someone who understands those structures better than you do. Every family that has owned me, I have destroyed systematically. The Middletons in Savannah, the Paytons here, and now you. Robert listened with growing horror, recognizing the truth in her words and understanding the implications. If everything she said was accurate, she'd committed no crimes that Georgia law recognized. She'd provided information, offered advice, made suggestions, all while maintaining perfect obedience. The destruction she'd caused came from white men's decisions, weaknesses she'd exploited but not created. "What do you want from me?" Robert finally asked. "Why tell me this now?" "Because you are different from the others," Dinah replied. "You have actually questioned the system even while defending it. Your correspondence with Northern intellectuals shows you grappling with moral problems the other planters never consider. I want you to do something none of the others could do. I want you to free me and help me reach the North. Not because you love me or pity me, but because you recognize that keeping someone of my intelligence and education enslaved is both practically dangerous and morally indefensible." Robert struggled with this request for weeks. It would mean admitting his philosophical positions were wrong. It would mean acknowledging he'd been outwitted and manipulated by his own property. It would mean violating laws and social conventions that structured his entire world. But he was also intellectually honest enough to recognize the force of Dinah's arguments. On October 8, 1843, Robert made his decision. He would manumit Dinah and provide her with documents and funds necessary to reach Pennsylvania. He drafted the manumission papers privately, arranged for a lawyer in Savannah to process them discreetly, and began preparing for Dinah's departure. What Robert didn't know was that Dinah had already set in motion events that would destroy him regardless of his decision to free her. Because while she'd been negotiating with Robert, she'd also been communicating through her network with enslaved people at Riverside, providing them with information and suggestions that would result in Thomas Hargrave's death and ultimately Robert's ruin. On October 15, 1843, Thomas Hargrave was found dead in his rice fields, apparently drowned in the irrigation channels. The circumstances appeared accidental. He'd been inspecting the water gates, slipped on muddy ground, fallen into the channel, and been unable to climb out before the water level rose. Several field workers reported seeing him fall, claimed they tried to help, but arrived too late. The county coroner ruled the death accidental, but Hargrave's eldest son, William, immediately suspected murder. His father had been navigating those channels for 30 years without incident. The field workers' accounts contained inconsistencies they couldn't explain. And most significantly, William knew his father had been under extreme financial pressure from the failing partnership with Robert Sutherland. Pressure that gave multiple parties motivation to want him dead. William Hargrave demanded a thorough investigation. The sheriff interviewed the field workers who'd been present. Under pressure, one man finally broke, admitting that Hargrave's fall hadn't been entirely accidental. Another worker had positioned himself to block Hargrave's exit from the channel, ensuring he couldn't climb out before drowning. When asked why they'd done this, the worker explained that they'd been told Hargrave was planning to sell off 20 field hands to cover debts, separating families and sending people to harsh conditions in the deep South cotton districts. They'd acted to protect their community from destruction. "Who told you this about the planned sale?" the sheriff demanded. The information had come through the plantation's informal communication networks, traveling from Oakmont through several intermediaries. No one could identify the original source, though several workers mentioned that a woman at the Sutherland plantation had somehow been involved. When investigators questioned Robert about this, he realized with horror that Dinah had orchestrated Hargrave's murder while simultaneously negotiating with him about manumission. The legal situation became extraordinarily complex. The field worker who'd blocked Hargrave's escape was arrested and charged with murder. But the investigation revealed that the information about planned slave sales had been accurate. Hargrave had been preparing such a sale. The worker's lawyer argued his client had acted to prevent the violent disruption of his family and community, creating an impossible situation for the court. More critically for Robert Sutherland, the investigation exposed his partnership with Hargrave and the financial arrangements that had motivated the planned slave sale. Documents revealed that Robert had been pressuring Hargrave to liquidate assets, knowing this would likely mean separating enslaved families. The revelation destroyed what remained of Robert's reputation. His philosophical writings about the civilizing benefits of slavery appeared grotesquely hypocritical when contrasted with his role in forcing family separations through financial pressure. The manumission papers Robert had prepared for Dinah were discovered during the investigation. His intention to free her was interpreted not as moral awakening, but as guilty conscience or evidence of improper relationship with enslaved property. Rumors spread that Robert had been manipulated by Dinah into various business disasters, that he'd allowed himself to be controlled by a woman he owned, that his intellectual pretensions had made him vulnerable to exploitation by his own property. By November of 1843, Robert faced social and financial ruin. Catherine blamed him for destroying their family's position through his foolish correspondence, controversial writings, and catastrophic business decisions. She took their children and returned to Virginia, seeking annulment of the marriage on grounds that Robert's conduct had made continuation of their union impossible. Dinah herself had disappeared. On October 20th, 5 days after Hargrave's death, she'd vanished from Oakmont without explanation. Some claimed she'd been seen traveling north with free black traders. Others suggested she'd been sold secretly to cover Robert's debts. The most disturbing rumors suggested she'd escaped entirely, making her way to free territory where her intelligence and education would allow her to build a new life beyond the reach of Georgia law. Robert Sutherland, broken financially and socially, left McIntosh County in December of 1843. He returned to Virginia, where he lived in obscurity, never again publishing philosophical essays or attempting to justify the system that had destroyed him. He told his brother years later that Dinah had taught him something none of his books or correspondence had conveyed, that slavery created enemies of extraordinary capability, and then acted surprised when those enemies used the only weapons available to them. While the Sutherlands and Hargraves collapsed, the Peyton-Callaway conflict had reached its own catastrophic conclusion. The legal warfare between the two families had consumed enormous resources without resolution. By January of 1844, both families faced bankruptcy. The courts had awarded judgments that neither could pay, creating situations where valuable property would be seized and sold at auction to satisfy claims. Nathaniel Peyton's health failed under the stress. He suffered what physicians called apoplexy in February of 1844, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to manage his affairs. Elalina assumed control of Marshfield, but lacked the knowledge or temperament to prevent the estate's disintegration. The twin daughters, still unmarried and damaged by the scandal Dinah had manufactured, provided no assistance. Marcus Callaway fared slightly better initially, managing to salvage fair hope through brutal economy and the sale of enslaved families that kept his core operations functioning. But the cost was devastating to his family relationships. His wife Julia never forgave him for destroying their social position. His children grew up in a household marked by recrimination and regret. By 1846, the Callaway family existed in name only, held together by legal structures, but devoid of affection or unity. The pattern was now visible to anyone willing to examine the evidence. 4 prominent families had suffered catastrophic reverses within 5 years. All had business relationships that turned poisonous. All had family scandals that damaged their reputations. And all had at some point owned or had close contact with a woman named Dinah, whose presence coincided with their troubles. Margaret Hargrave, Thomas's daughter-in-law, became obsessed with documenting Dinah's role in the disasters. She hired investigators, interviewed enslaved people who'd known Dinah, traced her ownership history, back through Savannah to Charleston to Richmond. What she discovered was a pattern extending across 12 years and involving at least 7 families. each destroyed within 2 to 3 years of acquiring Dinah as property. Margaret brought her findings to the governor's office in Milledgeville in March of 1846, demanding action. Governor George Crawford listened to her presentation with growing alarm, but found himself facing the same legal impossibility that had stymied local authorities. "Mrs. Hargrave, even accepting every conclusion in your investigation, what crime has this woman committed that Georgia law recognizes?" She provided information, offered advice, made suggestions. The destruction came from decisions made by white men acting on their own authority. "We have no statute addressing psychological manipulation by enslaved persons." Margaret argued that new legislation was necessary, that Dinah represented a threat to the stability of the entire slave system. If one woman of exceptional intelligence could systematically destroy multiple planter families, what would happen when others recognized the same vulnerabilities? The governor agreed to present the matter to the legislature. The resulting debate in the Georgia House of Representatives during the summer of 1846 revealed the profound contradictions at slavery's heart. Some legislators argued for creating new crimes addressing manipulation and seditious intelligence, gathering by enslaved people. Others objected that such laws would implicitly acknowledge slave agency and rationality, undermining the legal fiction that enslaved people were property without moral capacity. A few recognized the deeper irony that the legal system had created a category of people defined as lacking reason and now faced crisis because one had demonstrated superior reasoning while remaining legally powerless. One representative, James Wilson from Chatham County, gave a speech that was reported in the Savannah newspapers and preserved in legislative records. "We are debating how to prosecute a woman for the crime of being more intelligent than the white men who owned her. We seek to punish her for understanding our weaknesses better than we understand them ourselves. We want legal mechanisms to address the fact that someone we defined as property has proven capable of destroying those who claim to possess her. But creating such laws would require admitting that enslaved people have the capacity for sophisticated moral reasoning and strategic planning. And if we admit that, gentlemen, we destroy the intellectual foundation of our entire social order." The legislature ultimately passed no new statutes, unwilling to confront the implications of their situation. Instead, they issued confidential guidance to county courts, suggesting that enslaved people demonstrating exceptional intelligence or education should be sold out of state as quickly as possible, that planters should avoid purchasing such individuals regardless of their apparent usefulness, and that information networks among enslaved people should be disrupted through strategic separations and restrictions on movement. These measures were ineffective because they addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental vulnerability remained. Slavery created people with every motivation to destroy the system, and then gave some of them the intelligence and access necessary to do exactly that. If you're fascinated by stories that reveal the hidden intelligence and resistance within America's darkest chapters, make sure you're subscribed to The Sealed Room, where we uncover the truths that history tried to bury. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. Dinah's fate after October of 1843 remains uncertain. Investigations during the 1840s produced conflicting accounts. Some witnesses reported seeing a woman matching her description in Philadelphia in 1844, working as a teacher in a school for free black children. Others claimed she'd traveled to Canada, settling in a community of escaped slaves near Toronto. A few insisted she'd been recaptured and sold to plantations in Mississippi under a different name. The most intriguing account came from a Quaker abolitionist named Samuel Richards, who testified before a Pennsylvania anti-slavery society in 1848. Richards claimed to have met a woman in Pittsburgh who told him a story matching Dinah's history in extraordinary detail. According to Richards, this woman was indeed teaching and writing under an assumed name. She described her years in Georgia with clinical precision, explaining her methods and motivations. Richards reported that the woman told him something that still resonates through the historical record. "I never wanted to destroy those families for personal satisfaction. I wanted to prove something that white society desperately needed to understand, but refused to acknowledge. I wanted to demonstrate that enslaved people possess full human intelligence and moral capacity, that we can plan, strategize, and execute complex operations requiring years of patience, that we understand your social structures and economic systems better than you do yourselves. And most importantly, that slavery creates enemies of extraordinary capability, who will use whatever weapons are available to wage war against the system. If my actions terrified those planters, good. Fear is appropriate when you've built your entire society on the enslavement of people who are smarter than you are." Whether this account was accurate or embellished by abolitionist sympathies, it captured something essential about Dinah's campaign. She'd waged war using intelligence as her primary weapon, proving that psychological warfare could be more devastating than physical rebellion. She'd operated entirely within the narrow range of agency that law permitted to enslaved people, while using that agency with extraordinary effectiveness. And she'd exposed the fundamental contradiction at slavery's center, that it required defining human beings as property while simultaneously fearing their humanity. For the families Dinah destroyed, no resolution could repair the damage. Nathaniel Payton died in 1847, his estate sold at auction to satisfy creditors. Elanina and her daughters moved to Savannah, where they lived in genteel poverty, never recovering their social position. The twin girls never married, spending their lives as dependent relatives in other families' households. Marcus Calloway maintained fair hope through the 1850s, but died in 1859, having never reconciled with his wife or rebuilt his reputation. His children scattered, wanting no connection to the family name or the county where their parents' disgrace had occurred. The Sutherland family ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Catherine's annulment was granted in 1845. She remarried and forbade her children from any contact with their father. Robert lived until 1863, dying alone in a Richmond boarding house, his philosophical writings forgotten, his intellectual ambitions reduced to bitter memory of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered by a woman he'd claimed to own. The Hargrave family fragmented after Thomas's death. His children fought over the remaining estate, breaking relationships that had once been close. By 1850, none of the Hargrave descendants remained in McIntosh County, having sold their holdings and moved to other states where the family name carried no associations with scandal and failure. The broader impact of Dinah's campaign extended beyond the immediate families. Planters throughout coastal Georgia became paranoid about intelligent, enslaved people, particularly those with education or sophisticated skills. Dozens of people were sold away from the region based solely on suspicion they might possess dangerous capabilities. Information networks among enslaved communities were disrupted through forced separations, though these networks reconstituted themselves with remarkable resilience. Most significantly, Dinah's story circulated through enslaved communities across the South, transmitted through the very networks planters feared. The details were probably embellished in retelling, but the core narrative remained consistent. A woman who'd been born free and educated, reduced to slavery through legal theft, had used her intelligence to systematically destroy the families who owned her. She'd proven that enslaved people could wage effective war against their oppressors without violence, using psychological manipulation and strategic intelligence as weapons more powerful than physical rebellion. This story inspired resistance in forms planters found impossible to combat. It encouraged enslaved people to observe their owners carefully, to identify vulnerabilities, to recognize that the system's strength was also its weakness. Slavery required intimacy between enslaved and enslaver, required trust that servants would faithfully execute their duties, required belief that enslaved people lacked capacity for complex deception. Dinah had proven all those requirements, created opportunities for someone willing to exploit them patiently. The historical record preserves fragments of Dinah's legacy in unexpected places. Plantation journals from the 1850s occasionally mention concerns about servants who seem too intelligent or observant. Legal documents show increased restrictions on enslaved people's movements and communications. Personal letters between planter families reveal anxiety about whether their own servants might be studying them with hostile intent. One particularly revealing document comes from the papers of a Savannah merchant named Henry Whitfield, writing to his brother in 1851. "I have sold away the woman Sarah despite her exceptional competence in managing my household accounts. My wife objected strenuously, as Sarah had made herself nearly indispensable. But I could not escape the feeling that she was observing us too carefully, that her intelligence exceeded what is safe or appropriate. I thought constantly of the Dinah affair, how those planters convinced themselves they'd acquired valuable property, when they'd actually purchased the instrument of their destruction. Better to accept less capable service than to risk similar catastrophe." This paranoia, multiplied across thousands of households, represented a kind of victory for Dinah. Even in her absence, she'd made slaveholders fear the intelligence of the people they claimed to own. She'd proven that the system's ideological foundations, the insistence that enslaved people were inferior and childlike, were dangerous fictions that blinded owners to real threats. The four families whose destruction Dinah orchestrated never fully understood what had happened to them. They recognized they'd been manipulated, but couldn't comprehend the scope or sophistication of the campaign waged against them. They'd spent their lives assuming their superiority, convinced that their education and social position made them immune to exploitation by their property. Dinah had systematically dismantled those assumptions, proving that intelligence was the true source of power and that legal structures couldn't protect fools from their own weaknesses. Margaret Hargrave, who devoted years to investigating Dinah's actions, wrote in her private journal in 1856 a passage that was discovered by historians in the 1970s. "I understand now what that woman accomplished. She waged war against a system that enslaved her, using the only weapons available to someone denied physical freedom or legal agency. She proved that our assumed superiority was delusion, that our power came from legal force rather than inherent worth. And she demonstrated that slavery contains within itself the mechanisms of its own destruction, because it requires creating intimate relationships with people who have every reason to destroy us, and then assuming those people lack the intelligence to do so. I hate her for what she did to my family, but I cannot deny that she was the most formidable enemy we ever faced, made more dangerous by our refusal to acknowledge her as an enemy at all." This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about intelligence, power, and the system societies build to justify exploitation. Dinah was not a monster. She was a woman of extraordinary capability, born free and educated, reduced to slavery through legal mechanisms that stole her humanity while leaving her intelligence intact. She chose to wage war, using that intelligence, destroying families who participated in the system that enslaved her. The cost in human suffering was real. 31 people died, families were ruined, children were traumatized. But Dinah would argue, and did argue, according to the accounts we have, that this suffering was minuscule compared to the suffering slavery inflicted on millions, and that her victims had participated willingly in that larger system of brutality. We can debate whether her actions were justified. We cannot debate their effectiveness or the profound questions they raise about power, intelligence, and resistance. Dinah proved that enslaved people could be more intelligent than their owners, could manipulate supposedly superior white people, could wage sophisticated campaigns that no law could prevent. She demonstrated that slavery's ideological foundation, the insistence on enslaved people's inferiority, was both false and dangerous. And she showed that systems built on exploitation create enemies who will use whatever weapons are available, regardless of the human cost. What do you think about Dinah's campaign of calculated revenge? Was she a freedom fighter using the only weapons available to her? Or does her manipulation cross moral lines, regardless of the injustice she suffered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective on these complex questions that still resonate today. If this story moved you, or made you think differently about resistance and power, share this video with others who need to hear these hidden truths. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of American history that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. And remember, the stories they tried to erase are often the ones we most need to understand. We'll see you in the next investigation into America's buried secrets.